guys, so I'm here today to do my March reading wrap up. I'm going to give you reviews of all of the books that I read in March. So let's start from the beginning. The first book I finished in March was The Surface Breaks by Louise O'Neill. I was sent a proof copy of this one, however it is out at the beginning of May, so not long to wait, just a month for any of you that are interested. Now this is my second Louise O'Neill book. Louise O'Neill writes really powerful young adult books, often deal with feminism and sexism and equality as major themes. And the other book I read by her was Only Ever Yours, which is her dystopian work. Then she has a couple of contemporary works which I haven't read but do want to. And this is her sort of first foray, I guess, into publishing fantasy-esque work. However, this one is specifically a retelling of The Little Mermaid. Now, I wasn't sure going into this kind of what Little Mermaid we were retelling, if it was a mishmash of things, but it did very much feel like a retelling of the original Hans Christian Andersen story, and it's very dark in the same way that that story is dark, and it is not always very nice, and it's certainly nothing like the Disney version, but that doesn't come as a surprise to me, as the other book I read by Louise O'Neill was also quite dark and harrowing, but really impactful. And in this story we follow our main character, who is a young mermaid princess. She is the favourite of her father, the Mer King, and she is so fascinated by the land above. She's fascinated particularly because her mother went missing when she was only 1 year old, and she was supposedly abducted by humans, but her mother too loved the human world. It's set in contemporary times, so it feels very modern, very now, and our main character, the mermaid, has just turned 15, and this means she's allowed to break the surface of the water and see what is going on above, and she does this, and again, like I said, just has this massive fascination with the world above, so becomes a little bit obsessed. She saves a young boy from drowning, much like all Little Mermaid stories begin, and the story follows on from there. Now the story itself isn't that different from the Hans Christian Andersen tale in its overall structure. It doesn't massively foray away from the original plot, but it does have some amazing world building in it. So Louise O'Neill has really fully constructed this mer world, and she's also made it interact with the world above, and she's done an amazing job, and through that she's really explored themes of patriarchy and extreme sexism and female oppression. And it's dark, it's difficult to read, and the reason it's so difficult to read, like with Only Ever Yours, is because so many of the things in it, although pushed to the extreme, still resonate with you as a reader. They resonated with me and my experience as a woman, and yeah, difficult reading, but compelling and completely absorbing and wonderfully constructed. And yeah, a really good book, and I think if you at all enjoy your feminist literature, your young adult literature, fairy tale retellings like mermaids, anything like that, you will definitely find something in this retelling for you. The next book I finished was The End We Start From, which I've already given to a friend, so I don't have with me anymore. And this is a debut novel by the author Megan Hunter. It is her first novel, but she was previously published as a poet, and her poetic style very much comes through in this book. You can tell she is a poet. It's structured in very small segments, so little bits that are broken up, and you jump around a lot, and she uses very eloquent language. And it's a sort of apocalyptic type story. Our character lives in London, England, and the water levels are rising, presumably throughout the UK, although you don't actually learn that much information about what's going on, which means that our main character is having to flee her home. Everybody's kind of in danger, they don't know what's going on, where can they go, they end up in refugee camps. However, right at the beginning of the story, she has also given birth to her first baby, so it's very much about her being a new mother and dealing with all the things to do with being a new mother and raising her child, and her relationship with her partner amidst this climate turmoil with these extreme climate conditions, and not knowing what's going on and losing your home and all of that kind of stuff. But like I said, you don't learn that much. If you're looking for a sort of dystopian apocalyptic read where you're like, get to know what's going on and discover what's happening to the planet and get quite a action-packed plot to follow. This is not the book for you, or at least it's something to consider, because you do not really know what's going on. You don't learn that much. You only hear about things from the main character's perspective, and she throughout the story feels incredibly detached from what's going on, which I guess is meant to be a side effect of everything that's happening to her and the world around her, but because of that I also felt quite detached. There were certainly things I enjoyed about this novel, and I feel like there's definitely great potential in the author's writing, but throughout I felt very detached. I felt detached from the characters, all of whom just go by a single letter instead of a name. I felt detached from the circumstances because I wasn't really given any information, and that did put a damper on my reading experience. I flew through this book. It's less than 150 pages long, and I wouldn't say don't read it, it's terrible. But it didn't give me all of the emotional connection I was hoping from it. However, I know it has for other people, because other people were recommending it to me, saying they felt so connected to it, made them cry, they loved it. It just didn't do that for me at all. My emotions, again, were just very detached throughout. So I don't know if this is just a book that works for some people and doesn't work for other people. The next book I finished, however, was an audiobook, and this was a non-fiction book, and that is Feminism is for Everybody by Bell Hooks. This is the Feminist Orchestra Book Club read for March and April. So I'll talk about it briefly here, but Lauren from Reads and Daydreams and I will be doing a video together with a full in-depth discussion and review of this book on either one of our channels. I will let you know nearer the time on the Twitter account. And I'm really excited to talk about it with another person and see how the review goes in that case, because I definitely think it's a conversational book for sure, but overall I really enjoyed it. I had a really positive experience reading it. It is sort of introductory to feminist theory. It probably requires some base knowledge. It doesn't give you definitions of all of the terms, but I find it so hard to find something that pleases everybody when I'm talking about feminist non-fiction, and that's just because everybody's at different places and looking for things, because some of the really introductory feminist books other people find really frustrating because they're too introductory. Then if that's what you feel, if you feel like things like I Call Myself a Feminist or Feminism is for Everybody or Dear E.J. Awella, which are all quite popular introductory feminist books, are just too basic and don't cover anything for you, then this is probably the next book you should read, because it's still introductory in a sense, but it's definitely far more in depth and explores such a broad range of topics, which I really appreciate. I was so impressed by the number of topics Bell Hooks managed to cover in this book, which is quite small. And of course, because she covers lots of topics, she can't go in depth with all of them, but I think it gives you a really good overview. It gives a very strong sense of what I feel feminism is, and that is about equality for everybody. And also the overarching premise is that feminism is opposed to patriarchy, not men, and that's very important to remember, because patriarchy is bad for everybody. It confines men into strict gender roles as much as it does with women. It restricts us all. It just, however, considers women more second-class citizens than it does men, which leads to the further oppression of women in society. And that comes through very strongly in this book, and I think it defines that really well. And Bell Hooks also is very strong in the belief that feminism needs to fight for the equality of everybody, and it needs to consider all women when it's trying to overturn this oppression. So it's about considering women of different classes, different races, different sexualities, just different backgrounds, and how they are all oppressed differently, and how we need to consider that in our fight for equality. And so I appreciated her dealing with class and race and all of these other topics as well. And she also talks about the way in which women can continue the oppression of other women and can kind of support the patriarchy. And she talks about the importance of feminism not just being for academics, because she is a scholar, and feminist theory being accessible to all. Not that this book necessarily does that overall, like it doesn't do everything that needs to be done in making feminism accessible and creating feminist texts and media that everybody can consume, but it begins that journey. And this book came out I think like 2000, 2001. It sort of begins that, it sets that off, and it's a sort of call to action for more of that. So yeah, I overall really enjoyed it. I then read The Beginning of the World in the Middle of the Night by Jen Campbell. This is a short story collection. Jen Campbell does of course have her own YouTube channel, and so I hadn't read this cover to cover. It came out last year, but I had read a number of the stories in it prior to its publication because Jen is a friend of mine, all of which I already knew I enjoyed. And I'd been meaning to get around to reading the full collection at some point, but I knew there was definitely themes of things like death in there that I wasn't perhaps ready to read about. But then it just struck me one day that I wanted to read it, so I did, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. There's a lot of magical realism in these stories, there's a lot of theme of difference and othering and disfigurement, and the magical realism varies between stories. So some of them are way more magical realism, some of them are pretty much realistic. They're just lovely, you know, they're just beautiful little worlds that Jen's created that you get this little insight into, and you then can kind of build a whole other world around it. You get these like screenshots, that's what short stories are. They're like photographs, whereas novels are films, I feel, and they're just beautiful little literary photographs, and I just think Jen is a great writer. I've always thought this. I mean, I'd read her books before we even became friends, was already a fan, but I will tell you which of these stories were my absolute favourites in case you're wondering. So I loved Animals, which I'd already read and knew I adored, but thoroughly enjoyed upon a rereading. It gets me every time. It's a sort of almost dystopian / alternative world. Then we have Plum Pie, Zombie Green, Yellow Bee, Purple Monster, which I adored, which is about these children that have flowers and plants growing inside them, and they're sent to camps during the summer to kind of be harvested, and it's about them kind of embracing themselves. I love the title story, The Beginning of the World in the Middle of the Night, which again I'd read before, and it's very hard hitting, that one. Quite sad and difficult, but beautiful. And then I really enjoyed Aunt Libby's Coffin Hotel, which I had not previously read. I'd not read Plum Pie previously either, and I thought they were both brilliant, and I want more from the story with the kids with the plants in them. I wish that was like a whole thing. I want to know more. So yeah, I really enjoyed this one. And then lastly I read two poetry collections. So the first one is British Museum by Daljeet Negra. This is published by Faber Poetry, and I've had this on my shelf for a while, I've been meaning to read it, finally got around to it, which I'm really pleased I did. And this one contains a lot of themes of imperialism and the merging of cultures, British imperialism. Daljeet Negra is British with an Indian background, and he incorporates elements of his religion in there and his experience kind of growing up in Britain, but also his family's culture and growing up with an Indian family. And he also looks at things like the British Museum and other kind of historical sites and monuments in Britain and kind of what they represent, and kind of British history. And I just thought that those themes came through so vividly in this. I think he did a really good job of conveying all of these themes, and I thought it was really well done. Now the poems, the ones I loved, I absolutely adored. There were some that really made me feel quite emotional. There were others that just I didn't fall in love with. I didn't hate them, but it wasn't one of those poetry collections where every poem was amazing for me, but there were enough in this collection that I really adored to make it worth reading, I'd say. However, I wouldn't say it's the most accessible poetry collection. It's not necessarily for somebody who's never read poetry before. Daljeet Negra is obviously an incredibly intelligent man. This comes through in the collection, but I also think it can be quite dense sometimes, and there's a lot of references to quite obscure things, some of which I was familiar with because there was little references to archaeological sites, like archaeological Roman British sites, like Vindolanda, which I was like, oh, I know what Vindolanda is because I did archaeology and classics at uni, but then there was other things that I went over my head because I wasn't familiar with them. So I would just pre-warn you to say that's totally fine. You might not get every single reference in this, but I still think it's a good poetry collection, and I would read more of the author's poetry. I then read Don't Call Us Dead by Danez Smith. Now this one has themes of race, sexuality, sex, death, life, living with HIV, being HIV positive, and it's all quite hard-hitting. It's all very powerful, impactful, punches you in the gut. I feel like I've talked about this a lot recently, so I might be repeating myself, but that's how it felt. At the end of each of these poems, it was like someone had punched me in the gut. They always left me with such a visceral feeling. I came away with each one really feeling like the poem had got to me. It really struck with my emotions and was just very powerful. And I think I said before that this was a debut collection. It's not. I wasn't reading the back properly. This was actually talking about a different collection which was a debut, so I'm definitely going to check out more of their poetry in the future when I'm emotionally ready for it. But I would highly recommend this poetry collection to you all. Those are all the books I read in March. However, I'm definitely in the process of reading a few more that I'll have to talk about with you soon. I would love to know if you have read any of these books and have any thoughts, or if you're interested in reading any of them. I'd love to know which ones. And did you read anything particularly good in the month of March? I'd love to hear about it. Tell me about the best and worst book you read in the month. That's what I want to know. Until next time though, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye!